The town woke under a sky the color of cooled embers, the roofs still ticking from the night's quick storm, the roads brushed clean by the kind of rain that smells like new copper on old hands. In the gravel lot behind the diner, a boy retied his sneakers with an extra loop, a ritual that made his body remember carefulness, and checked the harness on the dog sitting at his knee. The dog's vest had a reflective strip, scrubbed pale by sun, a stitched patch shaped like a badge, and two faint lines where somebody with patient fingers had mended it. The dog sat because sitting was how steadiness began. The boy pressed his palm to the warm slope of shoulder and waited until dog breath and boy breath matched like 2 seconds on the same clock. He whispered the dog's name with the gravity children reserve for secrets and promises. The name felt too small for what the animal carried. It always did. People still said the missing girls' names softly, as if sound could bruise, and they said them less often now, the way a wound closes around a foreign body. 2 summers earlier, the city had put up posters in wet wind, the paper curling on poles, the faces fading from ink to weather. And the search had been maps pinned with circles that hardened into scabs called coverage and grid. Searchers had raked creek beds and combed pump house yards and called into culverts whose mouths ate voices whole. The canyon, west of town, learned the taste of flashlights and the syntax of command voices, learned how to swallow the disappointment those voices couldn't afford to speak. No one liked to say resources, but resources said themselves anyway. The town learned to hold its breath around the absence, to walk around the missing like a cracked stair you never fix and always warn others about. Watch that one. It'll take you down if you forget. The boy had been 6. The week the posters went up, a height measured by the bell on the diner door that kissed his head when he forgot to duck. He did not know rules about not getting in the way of long conversations with radios. He only knew the look that took over grown-up faces when they were trying to be kind while holding a full cup of fear steady. The dog had found him a year later at a fundraiser when a volunteer dropped a box and a dozen foam cups slithered like trapped jellyfish across the linoleum. The boy went to gather them. The dog pressed close, and they had shared a breath that redistributed the weight of the room. Somebody from the unit had said, "If you listen more than you talk, you can help." And the boy had nodded once with the solemnity of someone signing a document he could not yet read, but believed in anyway. The call came just before dawn, when the world had decided to be quiet a little longer. Possible. Sign. In dry ribbon wash. The quick storm had licked the canyon walls and left them bright and damp, had rinsed dust off old stones, had woken the kind of track that doesn't show itself when the earth is sleepy. The boy's mother, who ran coffee like a safety line through the morning, cupped his face in flower-sweet hands and said, "Come back with the day still on you." He said, "Okay," like it was the only word he had to spend. The dog jumped into the back of the unit's truck without pushing. Wind pressed his ears flat, and he let it, as if wearing the sky like a hood made him more honest. Out past the last mailbox, the road loosened into pale dirt, tire rattle like a low drum. Mesquite brushing the fenders with dry whispers. Voices on the radio solved puzzles in pieces, the language of coordinates and half-remembered landmarks. Go past the corral with the broken gate. Hang toward the notch where the vultures sit when the day is lazy. The canyon took over the horizon, the way a deep breath takes over your body. The wash was wider than last season, its skin combed by currents that had outgrown their beds. The dog stood in the tailgate's shadow and waited for the ground's first story of the morning. The boy clipped the line to the harness ring and listened between the radio syllables for that smaller sound. That meant now. They began where all sensible searches begin, with the oldest promise. We will go slow, and we will not force the earth to speak faster than it wants to. The boy did not say, seek. He lifted a small plastic tube, the way you lift a memory you don't want to smudge, and let the dog take the scent without hurry. The smell wasn't over there or over here. It was a shape the nose sees the way eyes see brightness. A contour that tugs you by threads you didn't know were attached. The dog inhaled, blinked once, like a lens resetting, then stepped forward in that sideways spiral lope he used when the truth was not a straight line. They moved like a sentence learned by heart, pauses in the right places, emphasis where the ground's grammar asked for it. A pale thread of cotton snagged on cat claw. The boy didn't touch it, only let his attention point until gloves and tweezers did work that left dignity intact. A blue bead glinted in grit, not new enough to be trash, not old enough to have been here before the story started. It went into a little bag without tears or triumph. The dog ignored trophies. He cared about air. He cared about the way sand remembers a foot and sun forgets it, about the angle of flies' arguments and the sulfur sigh of water far under rock. He led not by dragging, but by reducing options. The boy kept the line slack, the length of a promise that can still be kept. The canyon folded in. Heat traded for shadow, big sky exchanged for a lid of stone, noise distilling into foot and breath, and the whisper of brush pulled aside by a torso choosing a narrower way. The dog's ears became antennae, reading echoes for square footage. He paused at a notch where light lost its nerve and sat, chest full but steady, eyes speaking a sentence the boy had learned to read. Here lives a question that will not survive, a shout. They waited until their heartbeats slid into the cool. The boy lowered a hand and swept fingers along fur in the pattern they had invented for patience. Air from inside the notch reached them. A faint water grain damp, a hinge of cold carried on dust that wasn't old enough to be wild. The dog lifted a paw and set it down once, decisively, the way he did when information should be labeled. And the lead officer breathed the word alert, the way a librarian says a title. Moving into crease air requires gentling your shape. One of the officers crabbed sideways, shoulder leading, flashlight lowered into a narrower beam, the kind that doesn't blind a small animal into panic. Dust rose in a slow confetti and settled like regret. The light brushed raw stone, old fire smudge, the boxy dent a sleeping body leaves when it teaches a flat place to remember softness. Scratches on the wall tallied days, or calmed hands, or drew maps of places where the sun could still be counted. Uneven little suns with too many teeth stared back. Sign, the officer said quietly. Not desert old. The dog remained outside, his head a metronome tuned to a room he could only feel by air. The boy listened for the sound you can't rehearse. It came sideways. First a breath that didn't belong to wind, then the idea of fabric dragging, then a small object bumped by a cautious toe. He didn't speak. He made his hand a shallow bowl near the gap so air could pass through his fingers without feeling fenced. The dog, feeling the boy's spine unspool into attention, Unspooled too, eyes soft but exact. The officers spoke with silence, a choreography refined by drills and funerals and birthdays their jobs had made uncertain. One moved forward with water in a collapsible cup. The other presented a palm with no instructions attached. The light found two faces that had learned to stare without being seen, cheeks colored by dust, eyes narrowed against the beam, mouths thinking about trust. A small hand lifted a fraction and stopped, the way hands do when they are learning the shape of safety again. No one rushed the next inches. Everything that mattered in the room happened at the speed of plants turning to follow sun. Outside the notch, the boy pressed his forehead to the dog's neck and counted to 5. 5 is a square, he decided once, and squares don't tip easily. He said the dog's name without sound, just to feel the right muscles moving. The dog's tail gave one slow tap that felt like yes. The canyon remembered how to be a mouth and not a throat. The officers offered sips, little bites, a blanket someone had rolled tight and tied with elastic. Words stayed behind lips until they wouldn't bruise. They didn't say, found. Found implies that an ending has been agreed upon by all relevant parties. Finding is a verb that keeps walking. They said, here we are, and let here do more work than we usually let it do. The first girl moved like a bookmark, sliding out of a long book, then blinked at a sky nobody had proofed for her in 2 years. She flexed fingers that had taught chalk to be steady, and accepted the blanket as if it were not a gift, but a loan she intended to repay. The second girl came behind in the second officer's light, slower, her face doing arithmetic with what it was being given. When she stood under open air, she seemed taller than the world had told her she could be. The dog stepped one step in and stopped, sniffed, not like a detective, but like a neighbor, breathed a low vowel that means I am present and you are not alone. The second girl let out a sound the canyon kept for itself, a little spiral of air that wasn't language and wasn't nothing, and the dog's tail tapped twice. Some places call that applause. Up on the rim, somebody radioed words that had lived unsaid under a dozen meetings and 100 hot dinners. 2, alive. The sergeant didn't repeat them. Saying them too many times makes them thinner. She added coordinates, switched to a channel that belonged to only a few ears, and tightened her voice into a tool that could carry weight without bending. The boy stayed where the dog said to stay. When the dog refused the gentle tug to move away from the notch, when he planted his feet as if roots had risen under his pads, the boy knew there was one more small piece of the world that needed lifting before the story could get up and walk on its own. The officers saw it when the boy's attention traced a line on the ground the light had missed. Near the notch's lip, tucked beneath a flat shard of rock like a lid on a secret, lay a folded thing the size of a hand, the paper worn to fabric by too much touching. The sergeant teased it free like you lift an infant from a basket, breaths moving in a corridor between ribs and mind, and unfolded it edge by cautious edge. Pencil had stained the fibers rather than sat on top of them. The letters leaned like bodies that have learned to hold each other up. It said one sentence and drew a sun with 8 heavy rays. We stayed where the light could still find us. No one commented. The canyon listened to the sentence as if it had been written to explain it too. Leaving a place that has held your fear too long requires an etiquette most of us are not taught. The team made a path, not just for feet, but for dignity. Ropes that looked more like invitations than restraints. Pauses shaped into questions only the girls could answer. Hands offered with the palms visible, so the past could see what the present intended. When the procession climbed out of the wash, the town remained where it had always been. Trucks sun-faded and loyal, porch steps worn by good gossip, a grocery sign missing its O like a vowel it had loaned to grief. A couple of deputies stood with eyes that looked like full glasses carried carefully. Nobody dared spill. Reporters materialized the way heat does on a road, trying to put boxes around a day that refused to fit in. Boxes. The sergeant picked sentences like fruit, ripe enough to be useful, but not so sweet they'd rot. "We responded to a lead," she said. "We listened to the ground and to each other. When pressed for miracle, for motive, for a headline that could be worn like a shirt." She gestured at the dog and the boy, their shadows braided on sand. "He refused to leave," she said. "So we stayed." The girls did not smile in any of the ways cameras like. They looked at the dog, and then at the boy, and then at the space between them that had acted like a bridge all morning. The older one touched the folded paper, now tucked between blanket and chest, with fingers that had learned to save softness for later. The younger one's lips moved. Not prayer, but a rehearsal for language, so that when it came, it would recognize her. The boy's mother arrived without footsteps, her apron hastily unknotted and stuffed in a pocket, flour on her cheek dampened by tears that had outrun her towel. She did not sweep the boy into a movie hug. She put a hand on his shoulder and let his body notice her weight and decide what to do with it. He noticed. He stayed where the dog kept him. He breathed. He leaned a fraction into her. The dog leaned into him. Weight redistributed again in the only math the day trusted. Share until nobody falls. Stretcher wheels whispered on gravel, a soft, indecisive sound like paper deciding to be a bird. The girls climbed into the waiting vehicle, not because anyone carried them, but because leaving under their own power would make later easier to believe. The sergeant passed the folded note to a pair of hands that trembled and then steadied, because holding the sentence felt like holding a lifeline thrown back across 2 years. The dog stepped to the ambulance threshold, paused, and looked into the rectangle of white light, sniffing hospital air in advance. He backed up and sat with the boy in the shade of the door, like 2 statues placed to guard something that could not be named in public. Nobody told them they were in the way. The door closed softly between faces and faces that had learned each other. Reflected sun turned the glass briefly into a mirror, and in it, the boy saw him and the dog as one shape, the kind of shape that keeps other shapes from coming apart. The convoy left in slow grammar, no sirens, just intention, moving through a town that lifted its head from porches and produce bins and said nothing, because saying anything big would break the spine of the moment. Under the shade tree near the bus stop, the boy and the dog stayed seated long enough for heat to return to the ground, long enough for a wind to survey and choose to pass, long enough for the flies to forget news and go back to being flies. The boy let his hand slide to the place where the vest rubbed, adjusted the strap a notch. A small kindness he always remembered because he had once forgotten, and the dog had forgiven him too easily. He whispered a "thank you" that sounded like the dog's name and not like any human language. and the dog answered by pressing his skull into the boy's thigh, the simple trade of pressure for peace that had been their contract since boxes and foam cups and the day a breath chose a different job. When the sergeant finally approached, her boots moved with the politeness of a guest who has already broken your favorite plate and intends to wash every dish for a week. She crouched so her silhouette wouldn't take up more of the boy's sky than necessary and let the quiet speak first, then said, "We'll need to go through the formal things. They exist for reasons that today remembers." He nodded. He knew paper had its own weather. She looked at the dog and said, "You wouldn't move, would you?" As if scolding and thanking were sisters. The dog's ear flicked exactly once, which in his dialect meant, "We are not finished." She followed his stare back toward the canyon, even though her body was already pulled toward the station, and the hospital, and the conference room, where questions had been waiting with clipboards for 2 years. "Tomorrow," she promised, to both species. "We'll return early. We'll walk the path again, to learn where the ground held them when we forgot how." The boy nodded. The dog exhaled, and the day, which had been wound so tight that even time had a headache, loosened by one click. He rose then, the dog rising with him, the two of them moving with that odd civility they had invented, in which one never pulled and the other never pushed. They began the small walk back to the lot where the truck waited, with dust patted down by new shadows. The town resumed the gentle racket that passes for normal. Screen doors clapped. A bicycle bell tried out the idea of cheer. The grocery sign flickered and pretended it had an O again. The boy looked once toward the west, where the canyon had folded itself shut behind what it had given back, and he did not wave. Waving belongs to endings, and this was only a hinge. He put a hand lightly on the dog's neck, his fingers resting in the fur's lay, and together they stepped into the kind of afternoon you earn, the kind with room in it for the rest of the story to arrive. The next morning rose slow and reluctant, the kind of light that checks first whether the world deserves softness before it spreads itself. In the diner window, the posters were gone. The wall behind them looked lighter, where they had shielded it from sun. The air smelled of brewed coffee, and something new. Relief, trying to learn how to exist beside routine. The bell over the door still rang the same way, but every sound that followed seemed altered, gentler, like the room was echoing through cotton. The boy sat in his usual corner, booth, his dog's leash looped loosely around one wrist. The animal's head rested on his lap, eyes half closed in the patient, half-dreaming vigilance that working dogs never quite unlearn. The sheriff sat across from them, hat on the table, coffee untouched. Papers spread like an awkward deck of cards between his hands. "The families want to meet you," he said quietly, as though volume could wake something they weren't ready to face. The boy nodded once, and the dog's ear twitched in the same rhythm. 2 small agreements from 2 creatures who had spent the night not sleeping, but breathing through what had been left unsaid. Outside, the town carried on with the delicate theater of pretending things were normal. Shop doors opening, a school bus sighing to a stop, the slow, cautious laughter of people testing if joy was still legal. Somewhere near the edge of town, camera crews were already packing up, their lenses hungry for the next tragedy that hadn't learned to fight back yet. For now, this one had a happy ending, and that was bad for business. The sheriff rubbed a thumb over the rim of his mug. "There's something you should know," he said. He glanced at the boy's mother, who was refilling cups down the counter, and lowered his voice. "The note you found, the line about the light, turns out it wasn't just words. They wrote it in a journal too, before they A teacher recognized the handwriting. It's from a poem they learned in class about finding home after being lost." He paused, choosing the next sentence with care. "They didn't just survive out there. They built something. They were waiting for someone to listen." The boy looked up, eyes steady. "He listened," he said, resting a hand on the dog's neck. The dog's tail tapped once, as if punctuation had been provided. Later, at the small hospital, where walls still smelled of antiseptic and relief, the two girls sat in side-by-side beds, sun pushing through the blinds in warm, trembling stripes. They were thinner, their hair uneven where fear had been a poor barber, but their eyes were awake in the old way. Children seeing color again. When the boy stepped in, they both smiled the shy smiles of people unused to daylight conversation. The younger one reached toward the dog, fingers hovering above fur like a diver over water. "You found us," she said. The boy shook his head. "He did." The older girl nodded, voice a careful whisper. "He was calling. I thought I heard it in my sleep. Then I heard you say something. It felt like a sound that remembered us." No one tried to explain what that meant. Some moments live better without translation. A nurse came and went. The sheriff stayed by the door, hat pressed to chest. The dog lay between the beds, eyes flicking from one girl to the other, as if counting heartbeats. The boy sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, tracing a circle in the tile with his shoe. "Did you draw the suns?" he asked. The older girl smiled, tired but proud. "So we'd remember how big the sky was, even when we couldn't see it. It helped." He nodded, thinking of the paper folded like a secret, too important to stay hidden. "You stayed where the light could find you," he said softly, almost quoting, almost praying. She looked at him then, and something in that look, half gratitude, half recognition, told him she'd been the one to write it. "The light always finds what listens," she said. The nurse glanced over, confused, but the boy and the dog already understood. That night, the station smelled of wet metal and paperwork. The K9 unit had gathered around the dog's empty kennel, its chain still coiled on the hook. Someone had left a folded flag-patterned blanket inside, a retirement gift the department reserved for dogs who'd served longer than their handlers. The boy and his mother stood nearby. The sheriff crouched to meet the dog's eyes. "He's done his work," the man said. "We'll call it early retirement, but the department would like to make it official. He deserves a home with his partner." He nodded toward the boy. "If you're both willing?" The mother blinked fast, the kind of blinking that hides tears inside ordinary movement. The boy looked down at the dog, whose gaze answered first. Calm, certain, ready to be something other than a tool. "We are," the boy said simply. The papers were signed in ink that smelled faintly like new beginnings, and when the boy pressed his name into the form, his hand trembled just enough to make the last letter look human. The dog leaned against his knee until the tremor steadied. Word spread quickly through the town, as it always did. By morning, the local paper printed a grainy photo on its front page. The boy and the dog, side by side under a sky split by sunlight. The headline was simple, the kind that editors pick when words are too small. He refused to leave. People clipped the article and taped it beside old posters of the girls, some already taken down, some left up out of superstition. In the diner, customers ordered their coffee extra light, half as a joke, half as a prayer. The sheriff stopped correcting them. The next week, they returned to the canyon, not as searchers now, but as guests, paying respects to a place that had held on too tightly and finally decided to let go. The ground looked gentler in morning color, the air thick with silence that wasn't heavy anymore. The dog led the way, without leash or order, paws sinking softly into sand that had forgotten how to hide tracks. The boy carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, 2 small chalk pieces, and the note, edges laminated by careful hands. When they reached the crease in the rock, the same one that had once swallowed breath and fear alike, the girl's parents were already there, standing hand in hand with the sheriff. They had placed flowers, yellow desert blooms that smelled faintly of lemon and dust, by the entrance. No speeches, no ceremony, just presence. The boy crouched, unwrapped the bundle, and placed the chalks on the rock shelf near the note. The words fluttered, once in the dry wind before settling, the letters luminous in early light. He whispered, not for anyone to hear, "We brought the light back." The dog sat beside him, tail brushing his boot, eyes on the horizon. The younger girl's father cleared his throat. "You know," he said softly, "we used to come out here for picnics. Before all of this. They loved it. The canyon, the echoes. I stopped coming after. I thought the place had taken something from us, but maybe it was holding them safe, the only way it knew how." His wife nodded, tears tracking silent paths that dust didn't dare stick to. The sheriff looked out over the rim. "Places remember," he said, "but they also forgive. You just have to listen long enough." The boy touched the dog's vest, tracing the letters K9 where the fabric was starting to fray. "He always listens," he murmured. The sheriff smiled faintly. Then maybe that's what saved them. A breeze slipped through the canyon and turned the flowers slightly, all the petals shifting toward the same invisible point. The sound that followed wasn't quite wind, wasn't quite silence. It was something between, the hum of a space finally emptied of fear. The dog's ears turned toward it, then relaxed. The boy stood and took one last look at the crease, memorizing its lines the way some people memorize prayers. Then they walked back toward the truck, the world opening behind them like a held breath, finally exhaled. Weeks passed. Life reorganized itself around the new shape of peace. The girls began attending school again, smaller class sizes, quieter laughter. Sometimes they visited the diner, always sitting by the window. The older one drew suns in the condensation of her glass. The younger always saved a scrap of pancake for the dog, who waited by the door like he was guarding time itself. Once, near closing, the boy asked his mother why people kept stopping him in the street, thanking him like he'd done something impossible. She wiped a table, thinking, "They're not just thanking you," she said. "They're thanking the reminder that some things lost aren't gone, that listening is still worth doing." He nodded, pretending to understand fully, but the words followed him into sleep later, where dreams of wind and light folded around him like soft paper. Autumn arrived with its clean wind and its tired sunlight. The canyon grass yellowed. The town put up decorations early, as if to test how joy looked on them again. At the annual fair, 2 years to the week since the original search had begun, the sheriff arranged a quiet ceremony at dusk. No microphones, no speeches, just a small gathering under the same sky that had once refused to answer. A new banner hung between poles. Not all heroes wear boots. The crowd laughed softly when they noticed the typo, but the boy and the dog stood still beneath it, and laughter gentled into respect. The sheriff handed the boy a small badge on a ribbon. It wasn't official, not really. It just said, "Honorary Partner." The metal caught the last thread of sun before darkness took over. The boy pinned it to the dog's vest, right above the scar where the fabric had worn thin. The dog's tail swept the ground once, twice. Cameras clicked, but no one asked them to pose. Some moments don't need to be framed. They frame everything else instead. Later, as night claimed the fairground, the boy sat on the tailgate of a parked truck, the dog's head heavy against his thigh. Music from the carousel drifted faintly through the air, warped by distance. The sheriff leaned against a post nearby, arms folded. "You know," he said, "I looked at the report again. Technically, we never gave him the order to stay yesterday. We were already heading back when he planted himself." The boy smiled without looking up. He knew they were still there. Maybe he smelled them. Maybe, the boy said. Or maybe he just remembered what it's like not to be found yet. The sheriff didn't answer. The dog shifted closer, sighing the long sigh that belongs only to creatures finally allowed to rest. The wind carried dust and laughter and the faint hum of lights, shutting down for the night. The stars opened like eyes. Somewhere, in a house near the canyon's edge, 2 girls slept under a window that stayed open no matter the season, so the air could keep finding them. And on a street where porch lights burned low, a mother leaned against a doorway watching her son and his dog walking home in silhouettes. 2 shapes side by side, the smaller one talking softly, the larger one listening like it was his last duty. At the hill's crest, the boy stopped and looked back toward the dark line of the canyon. For a second, he thought he saw light moving there. Not flashlight, not car beam, but something slower, older, as if the canyon itself were breathing out. Maybe it was reflection, maybe memory. It didn't matter. He raised a hand anyway, not waving, but acknowledging. The dog stood beside him, eyes on the same glow. Then they turned together, descending the slope into the town's soft hum. Behind them, the night folded its edges neatly, keeping the story safe. Somewhere beneath the sand, in the hollow that once hid fear, the wind traced over a few words carved faintly into stone by small hands. The light always finds what listens. The breeze carried them upward like dust, scattering the letters into the open sky until they became part of it. Tiny, shining, infinite.